We're here tonight to talk about a moral and religious nation. And I the plan is to follow up on a conversation that was held a few weeks ago, but the time frames are still out of joint and we're working on it. So basically right now you just got me. And I thought I might like set the stage a little bit for what we're going to talk about. And so that those of you who haven't been following my most dangerous students' adventures will have a better appreciation of what we're talking about. So welcome to the Mosaic Arc. Okay. So I know you guys are here to hear what Milo has to say, but right now you just got me. So that's fine. And this is a conversation that he and I have been having for like 8 years now. So having a bit of time to set it up for you is probably great. And to sort of, weave. I've been looking this up, right? It's like Donald Trump apparently came up with that phraseology of weaving. If I can weave like our president-elect, then I will be very happy. I mean, we may be here all night because, of course, Milo is on a different time zone, and we're working on it. Right? So, in the long story short version of things, you all know I wrote to him back in 8 years ago in 2016, in September 2016. And I then started writing about him on my Fencing Bear blog. And the thing that I was trying to show everyone was how I saw what Milo was talking about was actually really about a religious crisis that we were in. This, of course, gave my enemies in academia a fair amount of fodder to play with, because I at one point compared him to Jesus, because it seemed to me that when he was doing his Dangerous Faggot tour around the country, giving the talks, the live streams at the various colleges, the reason that people were having such a strong reaction to what he was saying was, I mean, it was somewhat what he was doing, but it was, I thought, because I tend to look at for people at these levels, that there was really something deeper going on, and that he was challenging, I mean, by way of his talking about President Trump's campaign that year, challenging not just our political sense of identity, but also who we are as a nation. And famously back in February 2017, after there had been various adventures and responses to Trump's first inauguration, I was invited to reflect on this a little bit in a piece that I wrote for our it was for our Divinity School newsletter, and I was invited because I've been reflecting on the religious significance of Milo's talks and the reaction to them, right? And so I wrote a little piece called "Why Milo Scares Students and Faculty even more. And that's why in the promo for tonight I said my scariest student, right? Because he's been scaring people now for 8 years. And I mean, indeed, if you follow up on what happened after I did that sightings post, it was the Martin Marty Divinity School newsletter. That my original is still up, along with the packet of 7 responses that we got 2 weeks later, because indeed, apparently saying something like what I said in this piece was terrifying to people. And what was interesting was, what I mainly said, this was between the time of the Berkeley riot on February 1st, 2017, and Milo's deplatforming on the Monday of what was going to be CPAC week, right? I'm certain those of you who really follow Milo's adventures can keep all these dates straight. I certainly used to be able to, and kept them all in my Fencing Bear blog as an ongoing account of the crisis that we were living through. It's terrifically surreal for me this time around, right? Remembering what it was like 8 years ago, and remembering how happy we were in November 2016, and how horrified all my academic colleagues were at the thought of a Trump presidency. And I wish I could say that I was having the same degree of hope and glee this time around. Sorry, I gotta keep my phone open so that I can see things. I wish I could say that I was having the same level of hope and glee now, but I don't, right? And I'm not sure why, right? It's like I'm hoping one of the things that we can talk about tonight, if I don't completely doom pill off of all of everything, is it's just like we've those of us who know what's been going on. I mean, 8 years ago, I know that my sensation of something going terribly wrong in the country was older than that. I've been reading like manically for years before I started writing about Milo, because sometime, I mean, certainly by 2012 when we had that election, but sometime after 2008, it started to feel like we were in this different country, that everything was wrong and horrible and divisive and bitter. And people typically now, we end up talking about the cultural Marxism and the communist propaganda and layers like that. But I know I don't see very many people speaking deep enough about the religious crisis, and I still don't, right? I mean, I really, really don't. It's been fun, certainly. It's certainly nice seeing, for example, Notre Dame in Paris renewed and about to reopen. It's certainly lovely, seeing the joy that the Christians are having, the thought of being able to say Merry Christmas again without having to face down, the scolds for not being inclusive and stuff like that. But we have a lot to still consider what's going on. And one of the fundamental things is this problem that I set up in the sightings piece that I thought was the original problem that people were responding to in Milo's talks. The violence of the protests that we had back in 2016, 2017. Milo was, fairly new to our country at that point, and told Tucker Carlson on Fox News that he had imagined that, could come to America and do and say anything. But he found that, of course, we were much more restricted than that. We had the groupthink and the penalties and, social institution and financial penalties for free expression like nothing I experienced before. It's gotten worse in England now. So, at least we're not yet imprisoning people for memes, and hopefully by now we are, going to have a reprieve from this level of censorship. But we're still in some difficulty, right? Because as Andrew Breitbart, used to like to say that politics downstream from culture. Culture's wellspring, I say, in this piece, is religion. The one thing that most colleges and universities, their students and faculty claim as a result of their commitment to academic freedom not to have, right? I got so much pushback from this saying it's like, in fact, we claim to be secular in our academy and claim that that is our primary educational tradition. But of course, that's not wrong. Sorry, that's not right. That's in fact wrong. The tradition of higher education in America is deeply indebted to Christian ideals. And Milo had quoted some of this in one of his talks, the Minnesota State University talk that he gave shortly before Christmas, talking about how the first law in America to require general education was called the Old Deluder Satan Act to teach children to read the Bible in 1647. 122 of the first 123 colleges in America were Christian universities. Think about Harvard University, one of the epicenters of liberalism today. This is still quoting Milo. This is the founding statement about Harvard. Harvard, right? Quote, "Let every student be plainly instructed and earnestly pressed to consider well the main end of his life and studies is to know God and Jesus Christ, which is eternal life." John 17:3. And yet, of course, if you talk to most people now in the United States, you'll still say, I mean, that the sort of level of freedom of expression, academic freedom, should not include statements of religious faith. We avoid those, well, maybe some. Well, I think even with the protests, the Palestinian protests last year, that religion was not really a feature of most people's conversation. I mean, it was mostly a political problem of Israel's reactions to October 7th and the role of Hamas, or now Hezbollah, in resisting Israeli expansion of its borders. And it's mainly a political and military argument, and I most of the time see nothing like a proper theological argument. And this was very much to my point in the sightings piece, that like we don't talk about it anymore in academia. It's not there as an issue that anybody has any practice at, and that was my contention, that's why we end up in screaming fights, because religion, I mean, everyone says, "Oh, we're not going to talk about religion, politics." Well, we seem to be able to talk about politics now, but it's like we don't talk about religion yet. Maybe talk about it in horror. It's like, well, if so-and-so says such and such, he's going to do X, right? He's going to bring bombs down on Jerusalem, or, if we aren't paying proper attention to the way in which women's health care is being taken care of, because some people think it's murder and some people think, well, okay. It is a religious debate, and we are, as a country, terrible at articulating exactly what that means. And for my own part, I don't see the conversation, the statements that people make online about Christ as King as particularly helpful in this respect, because they never unpack what that actually means, right? Why are we so bad at it? Well, in the Sightings article, I talked about how it was in fact the Protestants. I mean, the Catholics are not really in this conversation in modern in American culture until the late 20th century, until like mid-century, with the production codes in Hollywood, and at least now with the debate over abortion. In the 19th century, the Catholics tended to be setting up their own schools, fighting to a certain degree their ability to set up those, fighting for their ability to set up those schools. But the main academic debates were obviously going on at places like Harvard and Yale and Princeton, which were all Protestant. And the Protestants had run into this problem that they couldn't agree on anything. That's why they're all here, right? That's why there's, so many different states in the original colonies that would turn into the United States. They all, as we've talked about at some length in some context here, they were founded by different parts of the English Civil War, different factions from the England, with the Congregationalists or Yankees up in the north, the Puritans, Happy Thanksgiving, right? The Virginians or the Episcopalians down there in the middle, the Midlands with the Quakers and the so that's where the Dutch are now. That's why we have Pennsylvania and the way that we do. It's sort of Quaker tolerance, which tended to drive everybody else nuts. But most of all, my ancestors, partial parts of both sides of my family, the Presbyterians who settle in the Appalachia and basically fight everybody, right? So we have these disparate Protestant groups creating what we now call the United States, and that's why they're different colonies and they're all settling further apart from each other because they don't get along. Agreeing in the course of putting together the Constitution for this new entity that they call the United States of America, not to try to resolve the question that they hadn't been able to resolve as groups in England, which is which church do we all belong to? Agreeing that there will be no established church, but carrying on with their religious instruction and self-identification as Christians through these different intellectual strands, right? And the problem was in the 19th century, as Stephen Prothero showed, the academics were getting kind of tired of these debates, right? He says, weary of quarrels among the various Protestant denominations, universities shifted their emphasis of their courses on religion from theology to morality, while unsectarianism became a guiding institutional ideal. The idea, as Prothero, who's Catholic, shows in this, he calls it religious literacy, what every American needs to know and doesn't. And he's saying back in the 19th century, when the Protestants, in trying to make some more of a network of higher education, even though most of the schools, most of our colleges, liberal arts colleges, are founded by Christians as seminaries, including the University of Chicago. It was originally founded as a Baptist seminary. We have a giant chapel on campus because it was originally founded with a divinity school, which is where this newsletter piece showed up, and which I thought would therefore be, welcomed by my colleagues, a feature of divinity school, saying studying theology matters. No, they got mad at me and said I wasn't diverse enough. Seriously, they did. They hated it. It's a fallout from the 19th century sort of gentleman's agreement to stop discussing theology with, in the 19th century, the expectation that, everybody's going to Sunday school, right? So the Protestants assumed that the members of their communities would still be going to Sunday school. They would still be getting their religious education. And, so we don't need to do that. Sorry, I'm just going to play with my settings here and turn my screensaver thingy off. Display and brightness. Stopping. Okay, no more auto lock. That they come to this gentleman's agreement that they're going to stop arguing theology and stop trying to figure out which is exactly the right theology to hold to, and whatever theological education the kids need, they'll get in Sunday school. The problem is, and this is the irony of all that was, in Prothero's telling, is we don't have, the academy became secularized because the Christians pulled out from their teaching in this context and shunted it off onto something else. I'd say we can see that kind of expectation we've given up in the public sphere. In other contexts with other kinds of debates, we should say, we need to agree on something, bland as it is, in the public sphere, and so we'll leave this undifferentiated nothing, which is a problem, right? But that secularization Prothero shows was not, in fact, a feature of religion being driven out of the academy. It was a choice on the part of the divines, to the Protestant divines, to leave it out, right? In the 20th century, what also happened is the Germans and the Protestant Germans are establishing the research seminar, the research university, and that Kantian enlightened sort of invention of new knowledge collides with the older seminary style of education, which was education in the classics for the reading of scripture, education in literature and mathematics and all of that. That our older academic institutions like Harvard and Yale were originally founded as seminaries, originally founded to teach them in Greek. and Latin and Hebrew, and they would become preachers. Presbyterians were trained at Princeton; they became preachers. But then there's this with all the Germans that come to the United States in the mid-19th century. We also get, therefore, ties to their education system and sort of, interest in the way in which the Germans are creating the research seminar. And the University of Chicago is an example of one of these hybrids, because the original University of Chicago was a seminary. It was not in the same location that our institution is now. It was a few blocks north of here. It collapsed because the presidents mismanaged the money, and it was refounded in its new location with the new president, William Rainey Harper, with a similar kind of expectation that was going to, teach the young men. There were also women in the original classes, but teach you had to have local universities at that point, because, you can travel on the railroads, but it's still helpful to have your own local universities. So University of Chicago is founded to teach the local people, the scholars. And Harper goes off to Germany and, studies to figure out how they can import the graduate level research seminars. So we have both a college, an undergraduate college that teaches you general education and so forth, and then graduate divisions that teach in the research context. And to do that, Harper also recruited a bunch of German professors. So we get that the University of Chicago is kind of schizophrenic in this way, but it's schizophrenic in the way the universities are in the United States, of both this older layer of seminary education and a top layer in people's prestige thinking of these German style research universities. None of this left any place for considering truth in the way that an actual seminary would. Now, we do have at the University of Chicago Divinity School, but our Divinity School has been pretty much since our founding, a place where you study not just to become a priest or a minister, which people do, right? There's still masters in divinity that people take, and they train in preaching and things like that. But our research level work in the Divinity School has always included, I'm pretty sure this is true, but it's always included a sort of world religions focus, because in 1893 in Chicago, there's the Conference of World Religions held to a certain extent in conjunction with the World's Fair, but not really. And that whole world religion claim, right? Now you see how many layers of problem we're dealing with. It's like the old layer of the intellectual work of the seminaries, the next layer up of the German Protestant research seminars. The German Protestants also in the 19th century are big on liberal theology and historical critical readings of scripture. So even bringing their interest in Christianity over in the way that the German Protestants do, like Bultmann, it demythologizes it. It creates a particular kind of theological discussion. It's not the older liturgical modes that everybody had in the Middle Ages, right? That all of these traditions grew out of, in fact. And then on top of that, you have the late 19th, early 20th century effect of all of the Protestant missionaries going out into the world and talking to all of these people in Africa, Asia, and finding out that, there's other belief systems that they as missionaries need to figure out how to consider. I just like doing a brief history of the history of religions is really challenging. But one of the things I wanted to talk about with Milo, if he comes tonight, maybe this is all just prelude, right? I can do a 2-hour lecture by myself on, it's like off the top of my head on prelude. That you can imagine that we haven't actually defined all of our terms particularly well, because religion in each of these different strata, I guess, if we're doing sort of archaeologically, means something slightly different. And so if we end up, as Milo did on the TimCast, in a debate over whether or not John Adams meant, moral and religious people to mean only Christians or not. You can't, I mean, the most people are, unknowingly arguing only at that level of the World Parliament of Religions, right? Oh, there's this thing called religion and all humanity has it, and you can't choose between them. Okay, why not? Ironically, one of the things that came out of that sort of generation of thinking is things like Joseph Campbell's A Hero of a Thousand Faces. However, Campbell grew up Catholic, and so his effort to show that there's, he's not even doing one world religion, he's doing one story that's out there, and you can find it in all religions. What he doesn't tell you, and what you need to understand every time you invoke Campbell's Hero of a Thousand Faces, there's a reason that story fits so well with Christianity. It is the gospel story. And what Campbell is doing, without fully admitting it, is taking the old way of missionizing that Catholicism had practiced, which was assume that all humanity has access to some part of the truth, and you will be better able to persuade them to Christianity if you find the thing in their tradition that is already actually partially Christian, right? There's a big hat trick in what Campbell pulls off, which is to show you that the truth of all stories is in fact the Christ story, except for, and then he doesn't do it because he doesn't want to. I'm not sure. I haven't studied. I've read Hero of a Thousand Faces and taught it with some students, thinking about what he was actually up to in the comparative study of religions. But there's a religion as the way it had been used in the debates in the 17th century, which then feed into what we end up in the Founding Fathers documents. There's religion as the way in which the Protestants agree to disagree and put it all in Sunday school in the 19th century. There's the next layer of, continuing European expansion, continuing American expansion, contact with other peoples, trying to talk to them, that then ends up in the place where we are now, where nobody believes in the truth, and yet you can't not believe in truth without going crazy. There is no way I can make this simple. Okay, so what I said was in my little short piece is that we should practice dealing with things at this kind of level, and that everybody was freaking out and calling Milo names and saying freedom of speech and he's just hateful and such. Precisely, this was my argument, precisely because we're in a religious crisis, and when you're dealing with things that happen at this level of reality, people are going to get upset, and you therefore need to practice thinking about the problems. That we haven't been, I suggested, is why we end up in the streets, right, with the fights. So that was my sort of original observation back in 2017, and I get to claim priority, and anybody else who's been coming along and saying, oh, we're in religious crisis, there were 2 or 3 of us that I was aware of in that year, understanding that what was going on was a much deeper triggering than simply even culture, right? Definitely not just politics. Okay. So I'm thank you all for joining me. I do hope you enjoy listening to me, because I'm not getting any response from the West Coast. Yeah, Casey's saying, I see the comparison. Yes, this is when I was writing my Fencing Bear posts, and I was just I had just finished my book, Marrying the Art of Prayer, sent it to press. I think I was sharing my Facebook memory from 8 years ago, a few weeks ago, right? I'd sent my book to press. It's the major work of scholarship for me. It taken me literally a decade to write it, from, beginning of research to figuring out how to say what I needed to say to last footnote. Sent it off to press in November 2016. And I was feeling like I'd actually accomplished something. And I realized also at that point that, yes, indeed, I'd spent too long outside of the church, and it was time to enter the church. And a number of the posts that I was writing about Milo that came after the election, particularly, was after I'd started RCIA, right? Milo was to some extent responsible for that, because he was like, incredulous. How can you not be Catholic? And I'm like, you're right, actually. Why am I not? And I think, I said that in the acknowledgments to Mary in the Art of Prayer, that as a Presbyterian, Mary chose me to do this work. And you all have heard me talk regularly on videos, lots of different videos, saying how it makes sense to me that I had to do that research to find my way into the church, because it's through the study of scriptures that the Presbyterians, I said that my family's Presbyterian, that the Presbyterians lost track of the long tradition, right? And I show in my books, in my scholarly books, that the Marian tradition is deeply, deeply scriptural. So anybody who's Presbyterian and you're anxious, I've written some books for you. And I figured that out to a degree that I felt it was, the timing was right. I was received into the church in March 2017, and it's the best thing that could have possibly happened to me, because the last 8 years have been horrific, and would have been, I think, impossible for me to survive spiritually without having been actually in the church. So there you go. It was a big deal. And in that sense, that, Milo was going around on his bus, and he had this band of young men, and he was, giving speeches in different places, and everybody was getting excited. And I'm like, this story seems familiar. Hero of 1,000 Faces or Jesus, right? Like, I bet if I'd said it simply as Hero of 1,000 Faces, everyone's, oh yes, oh, that's cool. Look, we're in mythological time. That's great. No, I said, like, it's the deep story. It's the understory of who Campbell was actually drawing on. And if I say that out loud in the way that Tolkien definitely also said, you guys know I think through Tolkien always, that, the gospel is the story where legend and history have met and fused. If we are living the Christian story, it's going to recur on us insofar as people are behaving in a way that reflects the image and likeness of our Lord. Well, one of the things he did was go around the country giving speeches and riling up the political class. So yes, Milo's a disruptor. This is Casey. Milo's a disruptor. Trump is the same. Neither is Jesus, but being a disruptor is definitely something Christ did. I'm certain neither of them is a saint either. I think they're definitely gonna have some time in purgatory, unless this is the thing, we don't know, right? We are not the judges, and my Presbyterian ancestors really, made a few difficulties there, because this desperate desire to make sure whether you're of the elect, well, you can't, right? And to the degree that the church allows us to pray through certain saints that the church has, by investigation, recognized as in heaven with our Lord, that's a gift to us. But it says nothing about how, the salvation of any one of us sinners, right? It's like the question is how we ourselves are in relation to God. So I was saying he was following the model, just like, I don't know, St. Francis did, although St. Francis is recognized as a saint. I spent a lot of this last year reading about Francis and Franciscan thinking, and I'm so in love with the Franciscans right now. You guys, I could keep going on that. Robert saying the metaphysical shift to Protestantism in the 1800s has led to so many different debates. If the problem in the academy generally is religious history, because all of those, particularly in the Anglophone world, right? Because all of the high-level research universities, were Protestant, that we do have high-level Catholic universities, but they weren't in the same sort of network of conversation or recruitment of students. The 19th century is so complicated we here in the Mosaic Ark have talked a lot about McLuhan and the telegraph and the electric and the railroads and such. Usually the effect of that media environment on the 19th century has, yet to be fathomed. It's astonishing and overwhelming. One of the effects was that, the historians of religion, they're out there. They definitely do have these conversations, but historians of religion are not integrated into the mainstream of American historiography at all, right? It's like, I don't think I can't think of any of my actual departmental colleagues who deal directly with questions of Christianity in the United States. I mean, I think it's one who's retired who used to work on the Southwest, and maybe he's Catholic, right? It's like the Protestants, they don't know how to integrate these questions with the philosophical and metaphysical level with the political and economic and social. And so it simply doesn't happen in the academy. We don't have a vocabulary or a rubric or a method for dealing with it. A lot of what that kind of conversation used to deal with has been pushed off into, for example, sociology, right? Sociology has a very powerful missionary argument for itself, right? That we need to fix all of society so that the individual can realize herself. That's part, the wokeness of the academy is very much a Puritan progressive wokeness, but it's a wokeness of, we will save, in sociology, we will save the individual through fixing all of society. The psychology, it's literally meant to be psychology, and there's no discussion of the soul. That I know for sure, because I spent 2004 sitting in on classes in psychology because I thought it would help me with my study of medieval religion. It didn't directly, because in fact, modern psychology has, one, it's medicalized and biologized, but it's biological in a lot of the same ways that our medical system is. And the sort of discussion of the soul, if there is one, it's of the self, which isn't quite the same thing. It's a field that doesn't know how to ask these questions. So you got psychology, sociology, political science is obviously about politics. So that's, there are some political scientists, though, that have a appreciation for the degree to which theology matters, for example, into understanding hierarchy. So it's coming in kind of in the other side with politics, could say. Anthropology, I'm naming off the other departments in my division of social sciences. I'm in history and social sciences, and these are the other divisions. Anthropology studies everything but Christianity, except for insofar as Christianity is like the encounter with the other cool places. Like we had two colleagues that worked on Africa, and for them, all of the African worldviews, ritual systems and such, those are the cool things. The missionaries, particularly the Protestant missionaries, those are the bad guys in their story, right? So the academy doesn't, it's like, talk about, I talked in my last solo flight a few weeks ago about the golden notebook problem, right? If I have my Substack now and I'm trying to integrate all of my selves in this, the disintegrated academy is needs a golden discipline, right? It needs some way of recognizing how these questions are fragments of this whole that they haven't been able to deal with for centuries. Okay. Robert, the return of Neoplatonism confuses the challenge of discerning Christianity from other, frankly, paganisms. Okay, that's yet another level. We can have to do like Arthur Herman's whole book on the Cave in the Light. Okay, so Robert's suggesting a lot of things which are bigger than I can take on just in this context. And you will realize why I tend to refuse the Protestant and Orthobro debates. Casey, I think the fact that Americans still argue over which Christianity to practice is truly a miracle. Christianity is foundational miracle. That's where I wanted to get to in talking with Milo, because one of the things that came up in the TimCast is, they're not able to understand what, like I said, the religion element. How even to approach Christianity depends heavily on philosophical concepts. Well, yes. And this is the sort of curiosity of all of these things is religion. One, I've described roughly. I mean, everything that I'm saying is very broad strokes, obviously, because I'm just talking off the top of my head. But also, it's sort of general impressions of how much certain kinds of things can be said in general academic conversations. Guys, there are loads of very smart and beloved colleagues in lots of different fields that do have interests like the ones I'm talking about now, but they haven't been the center of an academic discussion in a very long time. And that my authority for asserting this is a seminar that I participated in for several years back when I was writing Marrying the Art of Prayer. I did it, it was like 2011 to 2013 or 14. I can't remember exactly the dates. But it was in the time I was working on Marrying the Art of Prayer. And I was invited to have a conversation with colleagues in history and religion, sponsored by the Mellon Foundation. We met mainly at Notre Dame and some other places that the sponsoring, Notre Dame was in South Bend was the sponsoring institution. We kept talking. We were trying to talk about how can history deal with religion? And, there's two different axes that you have to deal with it on. One is the long axis of Christian history from antiquity through the Middle Ages, through the early modern period to modernity, and then at the intersection with other traditions, some of which have very long historical lineages, axes as well, like Hinduism or Buddhism or Islam or the Taoism, right? The old world religions, but others which, we don't have as much historical record because without writing, native traditions only have the history that we, find once the missionaries show up and start writing down their languages, right? So there's a huge problem in even what we're talking about in history versus religion. It was very interesting. We tried our hardest over 4 meetings to come up with some common ground for talking about religion in this group, and the group failed, right? And so, to a degree, the group's failure was an acknowledgement of the failure of, within religious studies, there to be a defining category that everybody was talking about. I mean, as a Christian, I think that there's an answer to this, but academically, the field is really struggling, right? So Robert's saying the Orthodox versus Catholic debates aren't a thing in America until now, maybe with the internet and worldwide discussion. Well, this is what's interesting is, how much, I hadn't thought of it in quite those terms, but how much this kind of debate can take place now in ways that it couldn't. I mean, all sorts of debates, right? We've seen the cultural world and the political world blow up. I think it's actually pretty encouraging that we have the religious conversation going on that we do, and that there's, podcasts and podcasts and podcasts out there where people are actually arguing religion. I find most of those frustrating because, I can't tell how well I often don't feel that the people in those debates have the kind of structure of the problem that I've just described for you, like the history of the debate itself. So they get trapped at a present level of the terms that they're arguing and don't realize that most of the time the terms that they're arguing themselves also have histories. Okay. Right. Okay. So, I mean, guys, I'm happy to take questions here. Let me see if I can ping. And I need to double check and make sure there's not conversation going on in the Telegram chat. Hello, Telegram chat. No. Okay, guys, this is well, okay, so let me refocus and think about that. We're in a religious crisis. Need to establish that, and some of the things that are happening in that religious crisis, from my perspective, are desperate inability to understand why the same word means so many different things, and that's mainly what I heard when I was listening to Milo on the TimCast, which I will I took some notes off of, and it's sort of reflecting on why I felt like that conversation was, I mean, as content. Wait, but it went round and round. I was impressed that Tim Pool himself had been really making himself understand the origin of the different amendments in the Bill of Rights, and saying, you know, that we, those, I think he didn't, I don't like when people don't give me their like bibliography, so I don't know exactly where they're getting the argument that they're using, because sometimes, you know, the same argument is in a number of different places, obviously. But to know the parent place where those things come from, like the Hero of a Thousand Faces, Campbell, it helps, because then you can understand the embedded assumptions that feed into that argument that most lay readers aren't aware of. This is the kind of thing that we try to train people in graduate school to start appreciating. It's like, wait a minute, why does Campbell make the argument that he does about stories and the way that he does? Oh, it's because he's from a missionary family and he wants to prove that all stories are the same story, except for he doesn't really realize that, you know, he doesn't acknowledge that what he's doing is in fact what Catholics had always been doing, which is saying that there's one true story. See? Right. So if you come to Joseph Campbell, I'm just going to harp on him this time. Because other people are talking about him now. If you come to Campbell and say, look, all stories are the same, Joseph Campbell proves it, and you haven't asked, why was Joseph Campbell trying to prove it? You don't get what the actual, like, claim is that Campbell was making, and therefore I suppose what kind of, you don't understand what kind of proof you can make based on the claim that he makes. And I just say Christianity, I mean, to me, the thing is, I'm not even sure, I'm not sure that he proves the point in the way that he wants to, because he misreads various stories to make them fit the paradigm that he's trying to get them to squeeze them into. It's like he's got, you know, Cinderella's slipper, and he's trying to squeeze the older sister's feet into it. But his impulse to say Christ's story is true, and therefore these other stories, insofar as they are true, will fit into it, I'm fine with that, right? But he doesn't admit it in those terms, and so it's a fake, not a fake, it's a misdirection or misleading ground on which to make the kinds of arguments that people usually want to make with Campbell, which is all religions are the same, which is not the point, right? It's like you can't make the argument that all religions are the same, but basically what Campbell did, because what Campbell did was show that all religions are Christianity. Okay. So what was going on in the TimCast? Okay, guys, this is all going to be prologue, so whatever. Okay, so what was going on in the cast of characters included people I don't know who are. Sorry, guys, I don't watch TimCast that much. One man who was Jewish, who Milo spent a fair amount of time making fun of, but who was American, and therefore he made fun of Milo a lot about being English. And they, you know, the most interesting part of the conversation for me was when. Sorry, guys, I don't remember who any of them are. All I remember is Tim has the hat, and Milo was wearing the hat too, and now I'm confused, right? The guy in the jean jacket, Elot, I think was his name. I was reading off the transcript to make sure I was getting all the terms that they were using, because I did not mean to be doing this by myself. Okay? That Mr. Jean Jacket had to ask Milo whether England was Christian, and Milo had to explain to him that the king is the head of the church. And I'm like, wow, somebody's education system really failed if people honestly don't understand that the reason the American colonists didn't want an established church is they just fled one. That the reason that there are, you know, Presbyterians and Anglicans, well, the Anglicans are kind of trying to stay with the established church without leaving, well, whatever, they're Episcopalians now. That there were Presbyterians and Episcopalians and Quakers and Congregationalists, Church of Christ now, that they were all different was because all of those groups had fled from England because the king kept trying to make them use the same prayer book, right? So the very reason that we have the English colonies established the way that they are, except for Georgia, the English colonies established as they were, is because they were fleeing from an established church. So they didn't want, they left because nobody could agree on what the church should be. And so they all ended up in the colonies, and then were agreeing to disagree. But the reason was because the king was the head of the Church of England, that there is a Church of England. And this guy, sorry, guys, somebody look it up for me so I can give his proper name, because I really didn't mean to be doing it in these terms. I don't know what Bacon level 1 Jort warriors are. Robert's saying the online debate sphere is growing so fast with heroes rising from many traditions. The blood is on the floor and online. The defeated may keep coming, but everyone can see. Well, yes, I suppose we're sort of this online coliseum, right? of sport, of debate. That was my suggestion in my sightings article. It's like, why not? I mean, maybe not online. I mean, maybe it's only going to happen online with, X and Joe Rogan and everything. Maybe these sorts of debates will only happen online with people sit still long enough to talk to each other, because they're, insofar as they can or can't happen anymore in the academy, it's difficult. Anyway, I lost what I was doing. Somebody give me the guys' names. The guy in the jean jacket. The shearling. I don't know. It had sheepskin on it. They ended up in a long debate over whether or not, when John Adams said that the Constitution was only appropriate to a moral and religious people, whether that not that meant Christians. Well, the point that Tim and Milo kept making, and the others supported them on, was, you're dealing with people that are simply assuming that everyone's Christian, and therefore they're not articulating that. I think there is better proof in the sources that they were drawing from to say that, yes, in fact, Adams and Washington were thinking in terms of a Christian theology, but it is true that the Constitution itself doesn't name it as Christians. What Adams was also actually talking about, Elihu. Okay, thank you, Felix. Elad. Oh, that's what. Yes, it in the YouTube transcript that I was using to take notes from it. It translated out as ELOT instead of ELAD. So Elad. That's good. Right. So what John Adams actually said. Oh, phooey. I've been having tech problems all day, and one of the tech problems I had was getting anything to print on my printer. So just a second. I'm also fighting that the iPad just updated and nothing's in the right place. Everything's tech wrong right now. Oh my gosh. Just give me today's today's photograph. There you go. Okay. So it's helpful to drill down into what John Adams was actually saying, because they got tangled up in this moral and religious people. And if you follow me in any fashion based on what I've said about how many layers of definition we have to go through to get to the point where we're talking about John Adams, simply assuming that you know what they mean by religion because you are thinking in Joseph Campbell terms or World Parliament of Religions terms or Protestant German historical critical theologians or Protestant American academics who are agreeing not to talk about stuff that they all learn in Sunday school. If you simply assume that moral and religious will mean what you think it is because you know what being moral is and you know what being religious is, you are wrong, right? They were also making various other errors. Milo was saying that Adams was saying it was about the Bill of Rights. It wasn't. He said specifically the Constitution. But if you take what Adams actually said in its full context, we might have a place to actually get in and make better arguments. Okay, so the place where Adams said this is in a letter to the officers of the 1st Brigade of the 3rd Division in the Militia of Massachusetts. I don't know why. I didn't look that up. It's October 11th, 1798. So it's fairly far in there. He's saying that he's received a letter from Lexington. They're unanimous address from Lexington, and okay, so they're doing something. Assume they're doing something, but this is the paragraph that everybody's fighting over, right? Okay, so he says, while our country remains untainted with the principles and manners which are now producing desolation in so many parts of the world. Again, you guys can do this research. October 1798 what's happening in the world, right? Wars, right? Usually Napoleon. Okay. While she continues sincere and incapable of insidious and impious policy, we shall have the strongest reason to rejoice in the local destination assigned us by Providence. Now, Providence, capitalized, always means the providence of God in these guys' conversation. It's not a term that, it's a sort of Augustinian term. It's not a term that shows up in quite this fashion very much in the Middle Ages. It's like the signature Protestant thing to say we're on the right side of history, right? Providence, whatever God designs, God's determining what should happen. This ends up with in what I feel like are a little bit caricatured terms of saying, you know, God meant this to happen, right? He says, while our country remains untainted with the principles and manners which are now producing desolation in so many parts of the world, while she continues sincere and incapable of insidious and impious policy, we shall have the strongest reason to rejoice in the local destination assigned us by Providence. Okay, so he's not saying, like there's all sorts of realities out there and ours just happens to fit in one. He says, no, we will follow God insofar as we are still behaving in a particular way, assigned us by Providence, right? That's the city on the hill claim that we also think about. But should the people of America once become capable of that deep simulation towards one another and towards foreign nations, which assumes the language of justice and moderation, while it is practicing iniquity and extravagance, and displays in the most captivating manner the charming pictures of candor, frankness, and sincerity, while it is rioting and rapine and insolence, this country will be the most miserable habitation in the world. Basically now, right? Or like 2020. If we start behaving with the hypocrisy that we see everyone else in the world adopting, just like assumes the language of justice and moderation. If we talk about how we're behaving justly and we're so moderate while behaving with, you know, raping and insolence, if we start behaving hypocritically, if we talk all the time about justice and so forth and behave against it, our country's happy now because we're still behaving with principles and manners. If we're still behaving as we should be and not the way everybody else is behaving, we'll be fine. But if we start behaving like the rest of the world, forget it. Because we have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. So we will be miserable because our government doesn't have anything. There's nothing in our government to deal with that level of human passion, which is, I mean, these guys they know they're Rousseau and they know Rousseauian arguments about the necessity of religion for keeping peace. That they have this, they have some understanding of the political utility of religion. But here he's simply saying, our government is not capable of coping with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. Avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net, right? Greed, ambition, avarice, right? Greed, ambition, revenge, or gallantry, right? Just behaving. I'm not sure what he means by gallantry. That's an out of context word for me. Would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net. If we simply behave like everybody else, there's nothing that our Constitution can do to stop that. Our Constitution was made only for immoral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. So, I mean, he's cautioning them, we can exist under this government as long as we behave. But if we stop behaving well, nothing to hold us back. And that, I mean, he says, some more, he goes on to talk about the militia. An address from the officers commanding 2,800 men, consisting of substantial citizens as are able and willing at their own expense completely to arm and clothe themselves in handsome uniforms, does honor to that division of the militia which has so much honor to its country. So he is talking in terms of they are upholding this moral ideal because of the way they're behaving as a militia. Oaths in this country are as yet universally considered as sacred obligations. That which you have taken and so solemnly repeated on that venerable spot in Lexington is an ample pledge of your sincerity and devotion to your country and its government. So I need to know more about this letter, but that is more context than most people are ever giving about what he actually says. It's not just our Constitution is only capable of it can't restrain us. This is it. It's like it will work if everybody's behaving uprightly and keeping his oath and not, behaving with, unbridled passion. But the minute people start behaving with unbridled passions and avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry, not going to work anymore. So, to me, that raises an acknowledgement. There's nothing in the Constitution that can answer the question of how to behave morally. It's saying that you have to assume that everybody will behave morally, otherwise this government cannot possibly work. Okay, so that's that, and that this is only it only works. We're only going to be able to live under this government insofar as we, are in. He says we'll be able to rejoice in the local designation assigned us by Providence. We'll get to be happy with where we are in history, but if we start misbehaving, forget it. It's not going to work. So that was, the moral and religious people thing is easily taken out of context to think, somehow our government is supposed to be strong enough to deal with the chaos of the psyche, but he's saying it simply can't. Now, what does he mean by moral and religious? And what I'm saying with that key word of providence, he's clearly thinking in the usual Protestant terms of, being guided in history, but insofar as we're not behaving as God has intended us to, providence will, punish us, right? So he's not thinking like generically about just morality, right? There's a specific thing that he thinks that we should do. What did he mean by thinking about the United States in this historical context? Well, we have another example from, this is 10 years before that, or 1789, so 8 years before that, from George Washington. This is October 3rd, 1789, and Vox published this on his blog as under Happy Thanksgiving, right? A proclamation. This is from George Washington. Whereas it is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God. Aha, right? So the President, father of our country, says it is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God. Straight up. Okay, now one, if you're going to start pretending that Almighty God can also mean Satan, we're already in trouble, because clearly providence of Almighty God, it's the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God. That's the context in which Adams would be thinking of providence, right? It's the providence of Almighty God. To obey his will, to be grateful for his benefits, and humbly to implore his protection and favor. These are standard prayers, right? Be thankful and pray for God's protection. And whereas both houses of Congress have, by their joint committee, requested me, it's George Washington, to, quote, recommend to the people of the United States a day of public thanksgiving and prayer to be observed by acknowledging with grateful hearts the many signal favors of Almighty God, especially by affording them an opportunity peaceably to establish a form of government for their safety and happiness. Okay, so we should pray for our government. We should pray that God, Almighty God, will give us an opportunity to make a form of government. Now, therefore, I do recommend and assign Thursday, the 26th of November, next, to be devoted by the people of these states to the service of that great and glorious being who is the beneficent author of all the good that was, that is, or that will be. Okay, the creator, right? Now, we can default into saying he's a deist, right? And I do think there is a problem here in thinking about Christianity. I don't remember what which flavor Washington is alleged to have fallen into. I know Jefferson spends all his time cutting up his Bible and pretending that Jesus is not divine, but the insofar as they're thinking of a creator and Almighty God disposes his protection and favor, and we're going to he recommends and assigns this Thursday to be devoted by the people to the service of that great and glorious being. Service. This, in technical terms, means like you're going to go to church, right? It's like you're going to attend to paying attention to God, his great and glorious being, who is the beneficent author of all the good that was, that is, or that will be, that we may then all unite in rendering unto him our sincere and humble thanks. Okay, so thanksgiving is to God, the creator, not generic godness, or even, I don't know, the world, the earth. I mean, it's Almighty God. He means it that way. For his kind care and protection of the people of this country previous to their becoming a nation. For the signal and manifold mercies and the favorable interpositions of his providence. Again, that word. I think when they say providence, they're within a Protestant theological claim. It's not outside or generic or Joseph Campbell or anything like that. It's Protestant. Which we experienced in the course and conclusion of the late war. For the great degree of tranquility, union, and plenty which we have since enjoyed, for the peaceable and rational manner in which we have been enabled to establish constitutions of government for our safety and happiness, and particularly the national one now lately instituted. So we're going to have Thanksgiving for the Constitution. For the civil and religious liberty with which we are blessed, and the means we have of acquiring and diffusing useful knowledge, and in general for all the great and various favors which he has been pleased to confer upon us. Okay, so thanksgiving to God for all of these blessings, which include the order of the society and the government. And also that we may then unite in most humbly offering our prayers and supplications to, and here, this is where it gets more interesting, the great Lord and ruler of nations, and beseech him to pardon our national and other transgressions, to enable us all, whether in public or private stations, to perform our several and relative duties properly and punctually, to render our national government a blessing to all the people by constantly being a government of wise, just, and constitutional laws, discreetly and faithfully executed and obeyed, to protect and guide all sovereigns and nations, especially such as shown kindness unto us, and to bless them with good government, peace, and concord, to promote the knowledge and practice of true religion and virtue, and the increase of science among them and us, and generally to grant unto all mankind such a degree of temporal prosperity as he alone knows to be best. Given under my hand at the city of New York, the 3rd day of October, in the year of our Lord, 1789. So at least he's like keeping who's the Lord and ruler of nations? This is George Washington writing in 1789, establishing the day of Thanksgiving, which apparently, I guess, doesn't become a regular holiday until the petition of the woman who wrote Mary Had a Little Lamb. But this arranged, he's asking for prayers to God, who is, in his language, the great and glorious being, the beneficent author of all the good that was, author of all good, and that, we're going to offer prayers to the great Lord and ruler of nations for all. I don't know why he doesn't say Jesus Christ, right? This I do find troubling and problematic, because the language that they're using is all definitely Christian. It's this abstraction that they're having to use. And I seriously don't know why, because they should all recognize Jesus, Christ, right? There we may have a question, but that they see themselves as under providence and under the author of all good is, I don't think there's a like a big option here that Satan is possibly appropriate to worship. You could say how much further out you can go. Are we going to include Krishna or Ganesh or the Tao, or they're speaking in completely Protestant Christian terms about the way in which they see the metaphysics of reality. So Casey's saying there's so many different types of Christians, to avoid arguing over how to address the Lord, they just didn't use any particular form of address. It does. the thing is, it does seem to me strange that they won't say the name Jesus. Right? It's like, what's holding them back from saying the name Jesus or Christ? Right? They're big on providence. They're big on, the author of all good, the being, the Lord and ruler. I mean, Jesus is Lord. It's usually, if you're talking about the Lord, you're usually talking about Jesus. So that they won't say Jesus Christ, curious. That is curious to me. But they're definitely coming out of this theological tradition. At least he's the creator, and the creator as the one to whom you pray and give thanks for all of these different blessings. So Robert's saying it's monad Platonic thought. Well, okay, so I did have. Sorry, guys, well, anyway, I'm sorry. I meant to be having this conversation with Milo because it's stupid for me to be doing it as like half of half of the telephone conversation. It's ridiculous. Anyway, yeah, the Trinity understanding. Now, so this is what's curious to me, and I think one of the elements of the game that they're playing here is the conversation about monotheism that happens in the 17th century, right? Monotheism as a thing in those terms is much less a feature in the medieval debates between Muslims, Christians, and Jews. I mean, they do worry about it as there is God, right? But this I'm frustrated and sorry about the refusal to mention the name Jesus Christ in this, because ironically enough, in the 19th century, of course, they're all talking about Jesus all the time. That you get the Protestant Germans, like David Friedrich Strauss, and mainly him, you're worrying about the degree to which you can use the Gospels as historical sources, and the degree to which Jesus is a mythological character. So again, to go with Joseph Campbell, by the time Joseph Campbell comes along and is saying it's a myth, he's following in the footsteps of generations of debate over the degree to which it is Jesus as a historical figure provable through the scriptures. Can you use the Gospels as the same kind of historical sources as you use, I don't know, Plutarch or Suetonius? That there is, in the 19th century and by the 20th century, Protestants in the 20th century, particularly following people like Bultmann, still want Jesus to have been something other than just a guy, right? But they're very, very anxious about exactly thinking about how he's divine, and of course that means therefore they can't talk about the Trinity at all. I've written a little bit about this in my scholarship, because in the 12th century there's big debates over exactly, not debates so much as there's devotional development of imagining the suffering of Christ at the crucifixion particularly, and you're meant to be learning compassion for his humanity. This I can go in great detail on this. But because the 19th century discussion was so focused on the historical Jesus, when we read the 12th century discussion about the humanity of Jesus, we think they're worrying about the same thing. Well, it's sort of back to front. I mean, the humanity of Jesus ends up being the thing that the 19th century and 20th century worries about. But in the 12th century, what they're mainly concerned about is the Trinity. And they're very interested in saying, well, okay, so he's God, right? The Lord Jesus Christ is clearly the Son of God. He's clearly the Creator. He's clearly the Redeemer. Their emphasis on his humanity is therefore on God's compassion for us, right? God's willingness to suffer what he did. By the 19th century, it's completely flipped, and instead it's like, how does it turn into that this person that we can have a historical argument about ever is recognized as a divine? And that is therefore why Milo and Elad are in the TimCast are going at each other. So Robert, how can we even approach Christology without defining the Trinity? Yes, exactly. And this is like, but in the notes that I'd made for dealing with all of this, right? Where am I on my notes? I made it through Adams, right? I haven't yet made. Still on page 1. Okay, so clearly this is fine, right? This is going to take a multiple layers of conversations. I'd say, okay, so it's fair to, I say it's from my Catholic perspective, as having grown up Presbyterian and therefore know exactly how Presbyterians argue, from growing up without any discussion of Mary, or, I mean, we could, I think Baptists say Jesus more than Presbyterians certainly don't. We tend to say God or Lord, and we don't really talk about Jesus that much, except for maybe at Christmas, and maybe, it's like, wait, is he a baby? I don't know. It's interesting. Modern Christian theology is you could see why they didn't think it was a big deal just to kick it into the Sunday schools in the 19th century. They lost all the cool bits, as far as I'm concerned. And they lose both the wrestling with the problem of the incarnation, and therefore the reason that the Trinity is actually a question in the first place. And a lot of the debates that I've seen online fruitlessly about the Trinity never seem to me to actually address this primary mystery terrifically well. But we're not there yet. We're not there yet. I need to refresh myself here. Just a second. I can't do theology on my own without wine. Okay. Have we, at least to you guys who are watching now, established that at least we're Protestants, that Adams and Washington are in fact thinking of a particular theology that they're working within? It's not like all abstract theologies, that they have a specific one. I hope that makes sense, right? Okay, so my next step was trying to say, having acknowledged that Constitution, as Adams is saying, he's saying it's weak, right? The Constitution is weak. It's not going to work unless people behave. He's saying it doesn't give you the structure to actually have a government unless everyone's behaving morally. So it has no capacity whatsoever to restrain our passions, which I find interesting. It's like, what kind of government would, right? What kind of, I mean, I don't even know where to go right there, right? But the next thing I wanted to break down and look at was the way in which he says, a moral and religious people, right? Why not just say moral? Because that's in fact what he's actually arguing, right? He's saying, if we're immoral, if we behave with avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry, the Constitution won't hold it. Why does he say religious at all, right? It's like he could just say, our Constitution was not made to control men's passions. Unless we're a moral people, it's not going to work as a basis for our government. Why say religious at all? Now, this is one of those like frustrating bugbears that I've wrestled with over the years, and it's interesting because in my primary work and in the texts that I know and know deeply, and that I write about and I try to show people in my scholarship, I'm a medievalist, right? So a lot of what I deal with as a medievalist is sort of struggling through this fog of modernity, trying to figure out why we even have the questions that we do now, because nothing seems to follow from what the texts that I'm reading are saying about, the light. The Franciscans are so beautiful. I could just talk to you for ages and ages and ages about how much the Franciscans, particularly in the 13th century, loved the image of light, and thinking about, physical light, like in rainbows and vision, and the divine light, and how Bonaventure is going to write a whole sort of, journey of the mind to God through the different layers of perception and the senses and the illumination of the mind. None of that seems to survive the 17th century. Which is sort of curious, because you think, okay, so what happened to the Protestants? I mean, it's not true, and it's not fair to say the Protestants have no mysticism. John Bunyan's Pilgrim Progress is a very interesting book. We could do, okay, I'm always promising things that we might do. Somebody's going to have to write them all down. Maybe Fat can. And say, like, you promised you to talk about Pilgrim's Progress and John Bunyan's vision. All of the American colonists are reading. They're reading the King James Bible. Why? I don't know, because they all ran away from King James's church. But And a lot of them are very interested in Pilgrim's Progress, which is this major allegory of the journey of the soul, right? And the main character is actually Christian, and he goes through all his various temptations. He ends up in Vanity Fair, and then he has to go through his trials and baptism, and a final vision of the celestial city and such. It's not true that the Protestants have no imagination or desire for the kind of illumination that Bonaventure and the medieval Christians did. But they do. I mean, one, because they're allergic to visual art, which means that by the 19th century they have no idea what any of the Catholic iconography is. There's some very interesting books by Anna Jameson where I come across these when I'm trying to figure out how to find all of the examples that I need for the medieval iconography. And she's like the legends of the Virgin, and she's writing for Protestants. A lot of these come out of like Boston and stuff. Henry Adams writes his Mont Saint Michel and Chartres to introduce his nieces to Chartres, and it's like, what is this iconography? None of the Protestants, because they lose all of that imagery, they don't know what a lot of the visual stuff is. They love the music, right? So they're the Methodist hymns and Bach, and their musical tradition is strong, but their visual tradition is very, very weak. And it's like something. I'm just like, I feel like my weave. I can do this. I can remember what I was talking about. I may or may not be able to, right? Oops, I missed. Okay. I think I was trying to imagine, it's like, what does he mean by moral and religious? And what does religious mean in this context? And I'm sorry, I can't remember where I started on that. I was wondering about why bother saying and religious, right? Because what he's mainly talking is morality and virtue. He seems to think it matters that you keep your oath and that's sacred, so there's some religious bond there. But what does he mean by religious? Well, this takes me to John Locke. And there's a sort of background layer of what Americans, when we talk about moral and religious, and we all say, well, toleration, right? And you have toleration thrown in your teeth for decades now. It's like, you have to be tolerant, right? Said with incredible intolerance by most of the people that are forcing you to accept, this toleration, right? And you're not a real American unless you believe in tolerance. Well, of course, one of the layers of tolerance which is what you all are, Casey's talking about this, that, okay, Casey's giving us the different flavors of Protestant. Jefferson was a deist and wrote the Declaration of Independence. Yes, Jefferson is his own invention problem, right? And yes, and the sort of, I think some of this is sort of going to have to percolate around in the background of what we're doing in Draco Alchemicus Act 4, because the loss of something that happens in the 17th century. So by the 18th century, you have this nonsensical reason divorced from passion, and mysticism and such. I'm sorry, I have, unfortunately, the hint of a weave thread that I've lost there, that's going to haunt me now. Okay, Jefferson was a deist. Madison was an Anglican and wrote the Constitution. Madison's wife was a Quaker. She may have influenced him. That's interesting. There are many influences during the founding of our country, but they're all some flavor of Christian. Yeah, right. But I think it does matter what flavors of Christian they are. And of course, when people are arguing these moral and religious, it's moral and religious, they're usually not breaking down what religious means. Oh, maybe that was my weave. It's like, I don't think they mean what I mean when I say it, right? For me, for the 13th century religious, it quite frankly meant a monk or a nun, or by the 13th century, a friar, right? Someone in a religious order, right? So the religious in the Middle Ages are the ones that have taken formal vows of obedience to a particular rule that they're living by, and it's they're bound to a rule. But you know, generically, it feels like it also means like piety and such. Religion by the 18th century in the Americas, they're all clearly Protestant, but religion, what do they mean by religion? Well, in John Locke's Letter on Toleration, which he writes in 1689 after having been in Amsterdam, and there's a lot of layers of English history there about why he was in Amsterdam, how he's able to come back in 1789, what kind of argument he's making. This is after the so it's how much of this do you all know, right? The civil wars that take place over the 17th century, which shoot all of the people into the colonies and end up with all these different versions of Christianity in the English, in the American colonies. There's the original revolt against the prayer book by the Scots against Charles I, which then turns into a sort of general parliamentarian resistance to Charles, by which point he ends up getting his head chopped off. And then there's Cromwell's protectorate, and then Cromwell dies, and after that there's the Restoration, and Charles II comes back, and he has cavaliers and long wigs and rowdy poetry and stuff like that. And then he dies, and there's James, and James is Catholic. Right, I think, and you know, the reason that New York is called New York is because they bought it from the Dutch, right? If they make a treaty, could they exchange it for Spice Island or something? And so New Amsterdam becomes New York, and it's named after James, who's Catholic. So New York is actually, both Los Angeles and New York are named for Catholics. So there you go. We should be a Catholic country, and I'm assuming Jamestown has a similar sort of layering. Maybe that's the first James, so he's not Catholic. He's well, his mother was. Oh my goodness. Anyway, James the Second is raced out. It is chased away by the Dutch, William and Mary, and William and Mary become monarchs in 1688. And so John Locke is writing this in 1689, during which time they've chased out the Catholic monarch, don't want Catholics to, they don't want the church, they don't want England to be Catholic again, but neither do they want to end up back with Cromwell and protectorate, right? So they want something else, right? It's like toleration. And what Locke opens his letter on toleration in 1689 with is, toleration is the mark of the true church. Straight up, the opening is, toleration is Christian, right? So it's toleration is the mark of the true church. And it's complete, you can tell by the end of the letter that he does not mean that there should be toleration outside of the church, right? The toleration is the mark of the church. This is a rhetorical trick to try to convince you that you can't force people to worship in a particular way, but assuming that you're all Christian in the first place, right? So the entire letter is about what it means to be a true church. And that's where we end up with this, bless John Locke for tangling the story up, that true religion is interior. The exterior forms, well, they might matter, but they don't know, but we can't tell what the difference is, right? And it's a sleight of hand. It's a very frustrating text for me to teach in Eurociv, and I finally figured out why. It's because it won't come to a conclusion. He cannot make this argument. It's a completely self-defeating claim that he's making, because on the one hand, you can't force anybody to a particular faith. So true religion is interior and it's a matter of conscience. On the other hand, and it seems like worship actually does matter, but because we're not sure which one's right, the magistrate has no business saying which one's right, and therefore you should tolerate all the different worship forms. And it's like, wait a minute. It's the same kind of problem that Mill comes up with when he's writing on liberty, 1689, 1859, almost 200 years later. Liberalism does not assume that there is multiple truths. They just are, momentarily agnostic about whether or not we can tell which one's right. But as soon as you can tell which one's right, shut everything else down, right? And that's, of course, what we've lived through in the past few years with our liberal politicians, right? It's like they're certain they're right about the wokeness and the diversity and the, this, that, and the other. And so they're going to shut everybody else down. They're behaving like proper liberals, which is once you figured out what the right answer is, everything else is bad, right? Well, so what Locke argues in his letter on toleration is, so toleration is the mark of the true church. The magistrate cannot enforce particular ceremonies and rites in the worship of God. So anything, and this, the sleight of hand here is enormous. Like if it's not illegal in ordinary life, it can't be illegal as a form of worship. So the Eucharist, right? This doesn't mean, okay, is killing babies legal or illegal? Well, it's illegal, so you can't use it as a worship practice, right? It's like, but eating bread and wine, that, how could that be illegal? Everything only, Locke's argument only works, again, if you're already Christian and you are weary of particular debates over, art and music and exactly how the priest should dress and whether or not the priest can be married and stuff like this. And yet, Locke expects, as all of these guys do, there to be churches and you to participate in public worship, because otherwise you have no society. Mel, you're thinking about so Mel is saying, what happened in the 17th century? Was it the compass, circle, square, or roundness? I think the layers, we need to think more about what happened in the 17th century. Something wild happened. There's a lot of alchemy. It's the scientific revolution. It's Descartes and Hooke and Newton and stuff like that. The magic goes away. And somebody was asking me this recently. Oh yes, the talk I gave last week that I published the text of on my Substack. Like, why do we lose the integrated world that Tolkien and Lewis described of, this heavenly spheres interacting with what's on earth and, all the beauty and the harmony and the worship that's all integrated and such? What happens? Well, one thing that happens is obviously the Reformation. It shatters all of this integrated thinking. But we lose so much over the course of the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. We're in this shattered, broken world now, and some of it may be printing. It may be the sea voyages and the shift from the Europe as at one end of Eurasia to Europe as facing the oceans. We need to think about that. But you can tell that Locke does not mean, just like Adams is saying, it will only work with amoral and religious people. And he's thinking in terms of, living under God's providence, right? Locke's toleration is only going to work if actually the choices of worship that you have are Christian. And he's very explicit about the ones that don't get tolerated. Limits. One, he says very explicitly, you're not going to be able to have toleration for those who serve another prince, like Muslims. Right? And in this version of things, he says that they serve the caliph or the sultan in Constantinople. One of the things that Elad came up with, I think it was Elad says this on the TimCast, is, well, Muslims don't take this out of their law. And it's like, yeah, because the Quran is their law. That the whole point, I mean, this is ironically, right? Islam does not make this separation of church and state, which Christians seem to be able to, because, well, okay, there I just shot off on another problem. They don't see the same kind of relationship between the state and the church as the Christians do. Put a pin in that one. That's only Christians could think of the secular. That there is no secular for Islam, right? And that's and the obverse of this for Locke is to recognize the Muslims live under their prince, under their law. You can't have Muslims in this mix of toleration. It's just Christians that he's thinking of as tolerating. Neither can you have atheists, because he says those who deny the being of a God, you can't hold them to their oaths. And that is what's interesting, that Adams was very clear about in that letter. He's saying, your oaths do you still hold sacred? Well, you can't you can't trust anybody to keep his word if there's nothing that he's sworn on that is sacred. They still hold their oaths to be sacred, and Locke is very clear that atheists have no place in this toleration because you can't trust them. They're gonna lie because there's nothing to bind them to truth. Yeah, Mel, you should be taking notes on this. So she's saying printing press, standardized print, empirical language, colonial language. Robert, so when you keep hitting the philosophical wall, you may need 1,000 hours of Jim Bob. I did. No, I don't really want to. There is the philosophical wall is a bit of a red herring. And that was my next point in thinking about the traps that they kept falling into in the Tim Pool conversation. So we've talked about the Adams moral and religious people and pretending that he didn't mean Christianity. He clearly did, although it doesn't mean Catholics, which is I mean, not in the fashion. They're definitely Catholics. Maryland is Catholic, but they're thinking in Protestant terms for the most part. But they're thinking in these Protestant terms of oh, I remember I found the other weave. It was Kant. That's what I was trying to remember. The moral and religious. Okay, so you need to go back like about an hour because now I finally remember where I was going with that. Okay, moral and religious. We think of, can you be moral without religion? And as far as I know, Kant has something to do with this categorical imperative. You're not going to do to others what you wouldn't do to want done to you. There's a weird flip that happens somewhere in all of this deist philosophical thinking that starts abstracting morality from religion, which would have made no sense whatsoever in the Middle Ages. That's what I was thinking about, the difference between like they lose the mystical and such. That we think of morality as independent of, and then it's like what religion is, right? And I'm kind of holding out that as a little tease, right? That I will pull together in a few minutes. Like, what's religion, right? This maybe, I don't know whether Jim Bob talks about this, right? The 1,000 hours of why Kant thinks that you can be moral without religion. Nobody in the Middle Ages would have put it in those terms, and it wouldn't have been a question that occurred to them, because why would morals are just the way you behave. And so you're saying Confucianism is moral in the sense that it's about behaving well in a society. Islam has a morality. Mores are just your behavior, right? So it's in certain ways saying a moral people is saying a people with behavior. There's nothing there, right? And I think that's one of the things that happens with the Enlightenment. Say Adam Smith, right? It's like the sentiments. What is it? Moral Oh, I'm tired. What is Adam Smith's other book? Wealth of Nations. And anyway, what Smith comes up with in his how to be moral argument is whether you feel it or not. So it's like your feelings as the way in which you decide whether or not you're behaving well. It's simply about whether or not you're accepted by society. So moral of itself is completely toothless, because all moral means, mores are customs. It just means you're behaving according to the customs of the people that you're with. A moral people might, have all sorts of behaviors that don't actually align with truth and goodness. So moral by itself is vacuous. Yes, or Hegel and Kant, and somehow it comes out that because religion, right? And this is the what is religion. Now, Locke plays this sleight of hand by saying exterior forms are not real. It's he gets to that somewhat from Luther, right? Because Luther does this thing on Christian liberty saying, the inner man and the outer man. And the inner man is what's, salvation's about, and the outer man is basically just your behavior in society. Again, none of these things make any sense whatsoever if you don't want to have God as the focus of your actual life. What's religion? If you go, let's see. Modern academic departments of religious studies put everything in a big bucket and say it's both rituals, right? Religion is rituals, so there's different practices, and it's myths, right? Ritual and myth is the usual default to try to say what religion is in a religious studies department, and that will be what the anthropologists tend to focus on. They did a lot of studies in the 60s, 70s, 80s, some 90s still, talking about the definition of ritual and what's ritual. And I mean, some of my favorite books were, trying to wrestle with this, because it's from my perspective, it's what liturgy, right? But they never, without a focus on what the liturgy is about, they can't define what the religion is. And they also got desperately tangled up in the relationship between the stories that the rituals are supposed to be enacting and the myths and where they come from, and which comes first. Do you start performing the thing and then make a story to go with it, or do you have the story and then the ritual goes with it, and so forth and so on? And it's one of those flywheel kind of things that just keeps spinning and spinning and spinning. Kind of like my weave here right now, because I realize I've thrown all of this up in the air for you, and I can see it all for myself. And I was like, which thread am I going to pull and get you to think about it? Religion means worship, right? And what's interesting about the debates that they've been having in Christianity since the Reformation, has been all around, it's like, what's the right way to worship God? What Locke wants for toleration, he doesn't deal directly with the theological question, really, but he's just saying, we don't know which is the right one. We can't figure out which is the right one. We've been fighting for 150 years over whether or not to do it with this bread or that bread, or with this particular prayer form or that particular prayer form, with that book or this book. Stop trying to decide it at the political level and let everybody voluntarily choose which church they go to. Religious still, however, it's got to mean, it's got to be it's only meaningful in a sense is that you're actually directing your attention to God. Theory of moral sentiment, thank you, right? Which is literally a theory of feeling well, right? Moral sentiment is just feelings. Sentiment is feelings. So Adam Smith bases his entire morality on feelings. You want to feel loved. You want to feel lovely, right? You want to feel, and so you're going to behave in a way that makes other people like you. Okay, fine, if that works in Scotland in the 18th century, but it doesn't actually say what morality is, other than going along with everybody else, which is therefore why I think with our wokeness and our culture wars now, the worst thing you can possibly do is go against the group. Does that mean we make the right decisions? Of course not. That's why a number of us have been fighting against the going against the group and the masks and the public health behaviors and things like that, because that definition of morality is simply behave like everybody else is, because that's smoother. But I don't think, that clearly can't be what Adams meant when he said, a moral and religious people. You need and religious. It's not just for moral people, it's a religious people. And then what is a religious people? Well, by this point now, I'm kind of tired, right? So I think what I want is, if you guys have any more questions on what I've been saying, what we need to do in the long term is have I've gotten you to the threshold of theology, right? And I think, Robert, you're saying what you had beaten into you was 3 pillars of worldview, which are epistemology, metaphysics, and morality, and the need for cohesion between them. Remember where I started in this weave, which was, when I wrote the sightings piece, I said the thing we have no practice talking about is theology. And I can go back to that why Milo scares students, right? And maybe I've done a service here by saying it's like morality. If you understand that morality just means the way people behave, and therefore, if you feel like you belong to the group or not, that's, I mean, it's unsatisfying as a ground for behaving virtuously, right? Maybe that's, we also sometimes use moral, you know, like we're behaving morally. So he didn't say virtuously, he just said morally, and morally of itself is going to mean, you know, everybody behaves, you know, a totalitarian government would love a moral people, right? Because you just behave nicely and you wouldn't fight it at all. That we've given up on all of the difficult debates in American society. And I you know, as a Catholic now, I'd say this because basically we gave up on all the good questions that you know, the ancient medieval tradition had grappled with. And what we're feeling right now in this inability to define the nation, the country, the point of anything is because that moral grounding just leaves us hanging there. And then in the 19th century, the Protestants in the universities all stopped practicing the difficult theological stuff because they can't, they go with the John Locke toleration and just fine. Everybody's going to go off and do their own thing in worship, and that has no place in the public or academic conversation. And here we are, right, screaming. Now, that I think we're not screaming right now in the same way. I mean, there's a few people, they're crying on TikTok and stuff like that. There's been a shift, something towards, you know, like, what is Trump? What is he doing? People are, you know, questioning the degree to which is he king-like? What does that mean? It's like, there's theology behind all of that too, and we have not dealt with it or practiced it at all. What I said in my sightings pieces, if we don't deal with this stuff, my long prologue tonight, not to address these issues openly does not allow students to keep an open mind, right? This sort of toleration as if there were no boundaries. That's not what Locke said anyway. And, you know, reading it through the 19th century Joseph Campbell thing leaves us hanging. I said, their minds are already open and being filled with what they are given in place of religion, multiculturalism, race, class, gender, the purportedly secular ideals of socialism and Marxism. Particularly for those students and faculty who have little to no religious education outside of school, these ideals have become their faith, which is true, right? They are a grounding reality for them. This is why students and faculty find Milo so threatening. He not only challenges them to examine beliefs they have never been taught to question, thanks to his near charismatic appeal as the speaker. It's true. At least for those who attend his talks rather than stand outside protesting, he holds out the possibility of conversion, of changing hearts and minds. It is much easier to call Milo names than to accept the challenge he presents. Milo's tour has made clear how high the stakes are. If you drive out explicit theology from public education, you get not no theology, but only bad theology, theology never properly examined as such. It is a mistake not to teach religion as religion. The medieval university on which American colleges were modeled was founded as a place to wrestle with theology. All the other arts and sciences were intended to stand in the service of this task. And, you know, go on to say that, you know, we were dealing with this deep crisis, and if we don't practice it, we just end up, it falls into the streets. That the next stage of hopefully this particular weave has helped unpack. I mean, I feel like a lot of things, they get so compressed and damped down, you don't even realize that there's a problem, right? That there's a problem in the way in which we assume that the language that's in these 16th, 17th, 18th century discussions means what we mean now. because the conversation has changed, the context has changed. And so simply beating around and saying moral and religious, blah, blah, blah. I mean, Tim was trying to say things like there's the context for how much $20 is worth and stuff like that in one of the amendments. But the next stage that we haven't dealt with at all, which I'm hoping in future conversation to take on with Milo so we can practice a little bit, it helps to practice these things, right, is where we go with theology. And to leave you with that as a teaser, there was one word that came up in the conversation that I will leave it to you to think about as a massive trap. Robert saying the definition of virtue and vice are certainly in flux. They are, and I've been talking. I've been in my fencing bear at prayer. My tagline was training in virtue, to be wielded by God, because I had an image from Augustine about the soul as a sword to be wielded by God, right? And it's like training in virtue. But we don't even know how to talk about that anymore. I want to discuss debate bros and debate gals. I don't want to do those debates because those debates, the debate bro stuff, they don't define their terms. They tend to just beat each other over the head with whether or not they're the right pope or something. It's boring. Even quantum physicists are having a religion moment with Einstein's spooky action from a distance and the problem around observational context. Yes, I mean, what we're learning is the Enlightenment was completely shallow and silly. That they cut their roots off from all of the actual, foundations that they had. Mixed metaphors. They cut themselves off. They're dead wood now. Right? The roots are still there, and we can get new trees out of them, I guess. But we're not going to get anywhere unless we acknowledge some of the hundreds and hundreds of years of debate that have been going on around the claims that we're apparently trying to soundbite. Anyway, the term that came up that is the massive trap and that we need to talk through properly in future is monotheism. Right? You can say, okay, so deism, or here's providence, and there's the Lord and ruler. It's like the big trap which obscures the whole question of indeed what the incarnation is, indeed what the Trinity is this, but we're all monotheists, right? That's another of the terms that comes out of the 17th and 18th century attempt to resolve the thing that they couldn't resolve at that point, which was what is in fact the right worship. And maybe that's the best place to leave it. When they're debating over the moral and religious people, the morality is squishy and undefined because the religion, they're not actually taking seriously the question of, well, what is religion? What does it mean? What are the entailments of the theological claims underneath it? Okay. Vatican II, I guess. I don't know. So guys, I hope this was helpful. I'm feeling like I've left you in a fog, which maybe that was the only place I could leave you in just trying to unpack all of this. And I'm hoping, it's like we will do a stream, and Milo one day will be here with us. Next week, we're going to do the stream that we were going to do back for All Saints, but Casey lost her voice. My previous time when I was going solo, right? And the week after that, we have another guest, and then it's into streaming from my mom's basement, and we can't have guests when I'm streaming from my mom's basement. We have to do some other stuff. Anyway, so this is it to be continued. Thank you very much for joining me tonight. It's been great seeing so many people here in the live stream, and thank you for sticking with me. And I hope at least I've troubled you, and made you curious. That's I think the best I can do with an opening lecture. Okay. So, thank you very much for joining me. Thanks for your continuing interest in our journey through the deeps of the internet. And I hope, this one, well, we're still kind of out there sailing in the ocean now. So happy Thanksgiving. May God's providence keep us. a moral and religious people. Good night, everyone.